Come, let's be here up in the front so I can see you both. There we are. We're going to do a little Q&A. We've practiced. Now you remember how voices work. But I'm going to ask 2 small questions while you all warm up, and then we're going to need a little bit of a house light as well. My first question is, John, do you think that some of the things that Jemma is talking about that seem like science fiction, except that they have been measured, could be explained through some of the work that you all are doing?
Absolutely. As I mentioned, my own drive to do the work that I do is built from the magic and mystery, right? And we all have different languages that we use to describe the world. And the ways that indigenous people, which I think is kind of a way of talking about people that live close to the earth, people that are experiencing the earth very closely and have for generations, there is a deep knowledge. We often call it data, but I mean, there's a deep knowledge, and it's just one way of talking about the world. The whole goal of something like this, and I think what the goal of science should be, is to support that. I mean, as you said, the knowledge that many indigenous people have is deeper, wider, more breadth than we have in science. We need to catch up with that in many ways, and I do think this is one way to do that. And to support it with empirical data so that people are convinced, so policymakers are convinced, and that we have a better world.
It's also, I mean, it's really important to work in the way that you both are doing with indigenous people because of this sort of closeness and uninterruptedness of this relationship to nature. But at the same time, I think in a lot of places where, unfortunately and tragically, the indigenous people are no longer around, we can still have a traditional knowledge that can be centuries or 1,000 years old in some places that also kind of belongs to this category of people who have just lived much closer to Earth. Do you have anything specific on your mind, Jemma, immediately a reaction to this topic?
I was just thinking about sonifying all the data.
What?
Converting the data to sound.
Oh, yeah. We should create a sound module.
Yes.
So we can listen to every food.
We can have the sound of all the DNA of the apple.
Well, we are talking about, there are many other ways to look at plants and food, right? So one is food physics. So actually, while I'm here, I'll be going to Copenhagen and looking and talking to a food physicist, because the structure of our food changes how the chemistry then affects our bodies. So could we add to the periodic table of food structure, which is a whole other layer of understanding of our food.
That's fantastic. Jemma, I also need to know, how do you put nature on the board? As in, like, who is in the room?
So there's different ways of doing it. So Faith and Nature have appointed a director of Lawyers for Nature, which is a UK-based legal firm. There's also in Germany the client Earth. So first of all is getting the legal status drawn up, but then how do we actually listen so it's not just projection and anthropomorphizing? So what Faith and Nature have done is they've appointed a guardian who's the director of Lawyers for Nature. House of Hackney have appointed an indigenous spokesperson who has a direct connection and communication with the planet. And what I'm interested in is finding ways that, rather than having a separate individual entity, that companies, groups can, perhaps before going into a board meeting, listen to the frequencies of the plants, to have an embodied sensory experience like the meditation that we did, before making these decisions, so that it will infuse the way that we think, the way that we imagine.
I want to say right now that if hearing this makes you started really good and then it made you feel deeply uncomfortable, that's a clue that something important is going on, right? Why is it so threatening to imagine that you would listen to a person who speaks to plants, or that you yourself would listen to plants before going into a meeting? What could possibly be the harm? And is that about your ego? Or is that about, like, the quality of the insights that may or may not come out of it? It's very rich, right? Rich. Do we have questions from the room? We have a few minutes to do that. Let's very quick one. Here in front of me, you had the quickest hand in the room. Let's see if you can get a microphone. Yeah, let's pass. Keep waving, please. Yeah, let's do a big wave, so the microphone can find you. That direction, sorry, over there. Yeah, keep waving. Yes, that's you. Good work. Yes, there we are. Good. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question more for John. I'm from Hawaii. I'm a part Native Hawaiian, or Kanaka Maoli, and I appreciate it with both of you how you listen to indigenous voices and consider them because it's not always common. I was just wondering, for John, are there any indigenous or Pacific Islander communities already involved or connected to PTFI? And if there's like any examples, I was just curious.
Yes. Yes. So we have a number of indigenous communities in the US, but also each of those centers of excellence are engaging with their own endemic or indigenous communities. We haven't engaged specifically in Hawaii or Pacific Islander communities, but other than Fiji, so we do have actually one of our centers of excellence is in Fiji. And they, of course, interact with the indigenous community. In the U.S., we work with the Hopi tribe in the U.S. Southwest. Dr. Michael Katatwa Johnson is an indigenous professor. And look him up; he's an amazing person, and he bridges this. He does kind of similar. He bridges. He's deeply connected to his roots and indigenous knowledge, but he's a scientist that works on regenerative practices and resiliency. So the answer is yes, we're engaging with many of them and in the US, but if you have connection to a community, I'd be happy to talk about that as well.
So actually, that's the follow-up. Obviously, is how do we join? Like, do we use the open resources? Like somebody like me, put me in a lab. I use the open resources. But if somebody has a lab that's relevant,
yes,
how do they get in touch with you?
You could email me. My email address was up there, but foodperiodictable.org. Foodperiodictable.org is the website, and there's a way to contact us through that.
Fantastic. Let's do another question. Yes.
Thank you. Really inspiring work from the two of you. I'm so curious about social dreaming, Jemma. What's your experience so far? What have you learned in terms of what happens? Like what new signs or behaviors or ideas have you experienced in that kind of setting?
I think by removing ourselves from, because we often associate dream work as very personal, as very psychological, but really we're looking at what's going on behind the scenes. And you start to see, as we'll see with the word cloud, people sharing the same experience. Like in Greece during the residency, we were finding that we had this overlap of images. So we would draw and have an artistic practice in the morning. And some of these dream fragments and dream images would merge. So someone else would have an experience of the same thing that I had. So for example, a moth had appeared in my dream and someone else had that same experience. So we were just sort of playing with these ideas and then bringing it to the table of what would the moth mean? What does the moth represent? And bringing that into our practice during the day. So it can be surprising, and it's very fluid. It's not to bring too much expectation, and just to allow things to emerge.
We have time for one more. Anyone?
Okay. Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Duke. I'm from the Netherlands. And I was wondering for both of you what your view is on plant agency in this discussion. So if we see more behavior, sensing, interaction, feeling, and those kinds of aspects of plants, how do we see plant agency, and to what extent do we see the using sound or chemistry to interact with plants as something that can be a respectful relationship or something that has a threat of being paternalistic or manipulative? Very curious what you think on that.
Briefly, both of you. Yeah.
I'll just start with, for me, it's very much about respect. So one of the things that often comes up when people ask, when plants are intelligent, then, how can we eat them? But it's about approaching everything with respect. It's when we're working with plants, with frequencies, it's not about an extractivist process. It's about having the space and the offering and the communication with the plant that they're willing to engage in that practice. So I would never record a plant without asking its permission first and going into a sensory experience of that, which you can do this experiment with food, for example, from a kinesiology practice, and you hold the food to your chest and just feel if you sway forwards or backwards, whether your body says yes or no. And that's a similar way of perceiving and receiving information from a plant, whether it's a yes or it's a no.
What about you, John?
Yeah, so what an interesting question for a scientist to answer about plant sentience. And I have thought about this, right? Because what I would say is the sentience that may be in a plant may be there, but it is fundamentally different than human sentience, right? And that I think is very important to consider. We like to anthropomorphize because it's easier, the metaphor is easier for us. But I think it's actually more special if we truly appreciate it as fundamentally different intelligence than what we have. Maybe deeper, maybe better, definitely more interesting from our perspective, I think. So that's the first thing. I think if and when you ask permission to pick a plant, it's as much about you as it is the plant, I think, as well. When we have a culture and tradition where we ask for permission for something, it affects us mostly, right? I mean, internally it's affecting us because we now have a way of thinking about the world where we do have to ask for permission for something. We don't just take. And if our children do that, they grow up to be better people, right? And I think that this is actually what we hear from indigenous communities, is that this idea of respect, asking for permission, it's about cultivating a culture as much as it is respecting the independence of the plant.
Thank you. And I think that's also, of course, why this is so scary, because if you have to respect plants, then you gotta respect everybody. Then you gotta respect animals and ecosystem. You gotta treat humans well. It's terrifying, right? But it wouldn't be bad.